Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Carrie, and I am part of the programming team here at the library. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program in partnership with CT Mirror, winner of the 2026 Pulitzer Prize for Local Reporting. Tonight, in the second of the library's journalism series in partnership with CT Mirror, New York Times Supreme Court reporter Ann Marimow sits down virtually with host John Dankosky for a conversation on the court's major decisions from this past term. John Dankosky is a well-known and highly regarded radio personality and journalist and moderates the In the Room series and other events for CT Mirror. John also serves as editorial director for the national radio show and podcast Science Friday. For 25 years, he worked at CT Public, where he founded the talk shows Where We Live and The Wheelhouse and the New England News Collaborative. Before joining the New York Times in 2025, Ann Marimow spent 2 decades at the Washington Post, where she covered the federal courts for more than 12 years. Tonight, she offers her unique perspective on what the court's recent major decisions mean, their impact across the country, and their impact on the court itself. Please join me in welcoming Ann and John to our stage.
Thank you, folks. Well, hi, Ann.
Hello, John.
Oh, good. You can hear me and you can see me. And welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for coming out. And wasn't quite sure what the weather was going to do tonight, but I'm glad that we're all in here safe and sound in the library. So first of all, as we said, this is the second event in a really important series here. Thank you to everyone at the beautiful Westport Library for welcoming us here. This is a kind of a long-running tradition with the Mirror. At the end of each Supreme Court term, we try to sit down with a reporter from the New York Times who has spent the year, sometimes a whole career, covering the court to talk through cases that had the biggest impact on Americans. Following in the footsteps of Linda Greenhouse and Adam Liptak, we're welcoming Ann Marimow. Before she covered the Supreme Court, she covered federal courts for the Washington Post, and she covered state politics for, in a couple of states where state politics can be kind of weird, California and New Hampshire. Ann also comes from a newspaper family, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. She's not a lawyer, but has studied law and poetry and has written about sports for her college paper at Cornell. I kind of figure that blending law, poetry, and sports seems to be a great background for telling stories about this particular Supreme Court. So, Ann, welcome. Thank you for joining us from your home office in Washington, D.C.
Thank you so much for your interest. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. And I just want to say congratulations to the CT Mirror on its Pulitzer. I'm a huge proponent and supporter of local news, and your community and state are really lucky to have local investigations holding powerful people in the state accountable.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you, by the way, once again for saying Pulitzer. We just do that. We pull out that word every once in a while when we feel like we need a boost or some applause in the room. So you'll hear me just sprinkle that in periodically. For those of you who are in attendance here at the Westport Library, we gave you some little note cards to ask questions of Ann during the course of our program. You can feel free to just write something down. We'll collect those a little bit later on. We'll get to as many questions as we possibly can throughout the course of this evening. And of course, welcome to all those of you who are joining us remotely tonight on Zoom. I'd also like to thank a few board members of the Connecticut Mirror, Joe McGee and Bilal Sakou, who are here today. So we set up this conversation, Ann, to be at the end of the Supreme Court term so that we could look back on everything the court did. But like so many things in the Trump administration, it seems like nothing ever ends. And so today there's breaking news that you and your colleagues are covering. The administration is asking the court to clear the way for an executive order that would restrict voting by mail. And this is coming, of course, in advance of important midterms. What can you tell us right now about this case that you know?
Well, I'm lucky to be part of a big team at the New York Times. My colleague, Abby Van Sickle, knew that I was joining all of you for this conversation, so she quickly jumped on this emergency application from the Trump administration, as you said, challenging the president's executive order that would restrict mail-in voting. The First Circuit Appeals Court ruled against the administration and sided with state attorneys general who are challenging this order. And the Trump administration is asking the court to act as part of what critics call the shadow docket, to quickly block that ruling and allow the order to take effect. So the court has scheduled or asked for replies to the Trump administration by late next week, and we will see what the court does. As you said, I thought it might be a quieter summer without a lot of these emergency applications, but that's not the case.
It's not the case, and I guess I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and how it's changed the role of the court and the way in which the court works. I've talked with your colleagues in the past about this. This shadow docket, this emergency docket, is something that we seem to be hearing about constantly, and it really means that there's not so much a Supreme Court term, so much as just this rolling application process by which there always seem to be emergency orders coming down.
That's right, and that's especially true after President Trump returned to the White House. In those early months, he issued, as you all will remember, a slew of executive orders that were quickly challenged in courts around the country. Many district court judges and appeals court judges promptly ruled against the administration and blocked those orders. And then the administration raced to the Supreme Court and said, this is an emergency. We need to be able to implement our new policies. And they asked the court to allow those to take effect. As you said, these were quick turn orders from the court. There wasn't oral argument. There wasn't the long briefing period that we usually see. And the court issued these emergency orders, sometimes without any reasoning at all. And that's drawn a lot of criticism of the court.
And we're going to be talking about some of the specific cases that the court obviously heard this past term. In this particular case, it seems to be part of an ongoing trend of the court getting involved in election cases. Do you see that like this? Do you expect, Ann, that the court is going to be involved in basically every election cycle that we have for the next couple of years?
Yeah, there's an ongoing debate among the justices about whether they need to get involved in all of these emergency applications that come their way. But just by rejecting these requests, the court is giving an up or down vote, even if it is preliminary. I think this is an interesting one. Elections are usually in the hands of states. So I think that the justices will be skeptical of this effort. We saw one of their big opinions at the end of the term. They rejected a Trump-backed effort to strike down a Mississippi law that allows mail-in ballots to be counted even if they arrive after Election Day.
But of course, they did rule during this term on redrawing congressional district maps. I guess I'm wondering if you feel like this is part of a whole that the court is considering, that they're thinking about the ways in which states are actually allowed to do mail-in voting, to draw district lines. Do you see this as all part of one particular whole that the court is considering, or are these really individually narrow cases that they're looking at?
Well, the Voting Rights Act case that you mentioned is not narrow by any stretch. I mean, that really undermined a landmark civil rights law that had sort of ensured many majority black voting districts throughout the South. And that decision had major implications, as we saw immediately. Legislatures in southern states in particular started redrawing their lines. So I think the court will take these as they come, but I think there will be many, many election challenges leading up to these midterm elections.
So I'd like to get into some more specific cases from this term, but to start, I'd love to get your big picture takeaway here from the cases this year. Do you see that there is one overarching story of this particular court term?
Yeah, so as you started with, when Trump returned to office, the court was issuing all of these emergency orders that were pretty much greenlighting most of the president's boundary pushing policies, and many of them were divided 6-3 with the 3 liberal justices dissenting. There wasn't a lot of reasoning. There was a lot of criticism. So going into the court's term, this is the merits docket where the court does have full briefing and oral argument. The big question on our minds was, would this court, with 3 justices nominated by President Trump and a conservative supermajority, push back at all on the administration and these sort of far-reaching policies? And I would say the answer, after the final decisions came down, was sort of a mixed bag. We saw the court pick its moments to push back on some of the cases that Trump cared most about personally. So you'll all remember the tariffs decision, birthright citizenship, Trump's effort to fire the Federal Reserve Board member. But sort of more broadly and long-lasting, the court did deliver a series of big conservative wins, as we talked about the voting rights case among them, another case to make it easier for presidents to fire independent regulators. So I'd say it was a mixed bag.
And the fact that it was a mixed bag is something that actually drew criticism of the court from Donald Trump himself. He seemed to be upset with some of his appointees who didn't vote with him across, as we'd say, party lines every single time.
Yeah, so President Trump seems to view his nominees as not independent actors, but justices who should be loyal to him. We saw this in particular after the court ruled against his sweeping tariffs on imports from major U.S. trading partners. He held a press conference and called out his nominees, calling them lapdogs and fools, things you don't usually hear from a president talking about justices on the Supreme Court. And you might remember that he was the first sitting president to actually come to an oral argument. And this was for the birthright citizenship case, which really showed how much he cared about it, but also critics said was sort of an effort to intimidate the justices.
What exactly was that like? And I think we'll talk a little bit more about, what it's like to be at the court during a big decision, but take us back to that day when you had a sitting president come and sit in the gallery as essentially part of the crowd to watch oral arguments.
Yeah, so in some ways it wasn't different than any other oral argument day, except that there was just a ton more security in the Supreme Court. You had to go through metal detectors, not just to enter the building, but also to enter the courtroom. They brought us into the courtroom even earlier than usual. And because everybody knew the president was going to be there, there were just many more journalists than usual and also many more people sitting in the crowd. But I think the court went out of its way not to treat Trump any differently than another party in a case. Usually when there are dignitaries in the courtroom, they get special seats up close to the bench where the justices are. But President Trump was seated in the front row of the public section of the court. And again, there was no acknowledgement or announcement by Chief Justice John Roberts that he was there. And he was seated, very respectfully and quietly in that row with his main lawyer. I don't know if he got to keep his phone, but he certainly wasn't looking at his phone. None of us are allowed to have electronics in the room. And then he left early after his lawyer was done speaking. I think he probably had other important things to tend to that day. But it was pretty wild to see him sitting there as these arguments were being discussed.
So since we're talking about that particular case, you certainly see this, and many Americans see this as one of the most consequential rulings of this past term. Take us through the legal arguments and how the court arrived at that 6-3 ruling on the birthright citizenship case.
Yeah, so you'll recall this was very early in Trump's return to the White House. He essentially tried to redefine the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which says Nearly all people born on U.S. soil are U.S. citizens, regardless of the status of their parents. Trump tried to dramatically limit this language and to say that it does not apply to the babies born to undocumented immigrants and to certain temporary residents. He said this was never meant to apply to these individuals. And I would say until Trump started talking about this was really seen as a long shot argument and just well established. And so you saw the court take seriously these arguments that people really had thought were kind of fringe until really recent years. As you said, the court ruled 6-3 to block the president's order. If it had gone into effect, it would have been hugely consequential and really redefined what it means to be an American. The one sort of nuance to the opinion is that there were 5 justices who said the 14th Amendment to the Constitution means that citizenship applies to all of these babies born in the United States, and 6 justices total who said this was invalid, and that's Brett Kavanaugh was that 6th vote who said it's certainly at odds with a federal statute that's very similar to the 14th Amendment, but he was not willing to go all the way. Trump reacted to this with a lot of disappointment and said that he could still try to change the law through Congress, but that's not correct because there were 4 justices who said that his order is at odds with the 14th Amendment.
What's interesting, Ann, is that it seems as though the justices took seriously this argument, which is why they heard it in the first place, and it's a obviously very consequential part of American life. But during the arguments, it seemed as though all sorts of justices were kind of treating the argument itself as, and I think this is a quote, quirky. Maybe you can take us back to that day, because it seemed as though the argument itself was holding up on an awful lot of very arcane and strange kind of originalist language.
Yeah, that was definitely a feature of the papers that the lawyers filed, and you're right, I think you're quoting Chief Justice John Roberts, who opened by questioning Trump's lawyer about his quirky argument, and that's never a good sign if you're a lawyer and the Chief Justice, who's almost always in the majority, is calling your argument quirky. But I guess I was struck by how much of the discussion was also sort of a policy discussion. You had Justice Alito picking up on President Trump's concern about this issue of birth tourism, where people specifically come to the United States to have babies who are American citizens, and that concern that could be a national security threat. You heard Justice Kavanaugh bring up these policy issues as well, but say that's not what we're here to decide. We're here to talk about the Constitution and federal law.
Of course, with a lot of these cases, and you are going to talk a bit more about this, there seems to be, during this court term, at least one instance in which justices gave in to Trump's demands and in some cases pushed back. This is an example of them pushing back against something that's a major policy issue for him, which is why he was in court in the first place. But around immigration issues, there was a very consequential ruling having to do with immigrants from Haiti and Syria that went the other direction. Take us through that court case, if you would.
Sure. This is the question of temporary protected status for migrants from nations that are struggling from earthquakes or war. The U.S. government, on a bipartisan basis, has granted these folks protections from deportation and allowed them to live and work legally in the United States, sometimes for decades, under these protections. As part of President Trump's crackdown on immigration, he has tried to end this program known as TPS, and he does have the power to do that. But the Haitians and Syrians and also migrants from Venezuela who challenged his effort to end the program said that his Homeland Security Secretary did not follow the proper steps when she ended these programs. And in fact, in the case of Haiti, the challengers said that this was based on racial animus for Haitians. You all might remember President Trump's comments about Haitians in Springfield, Ohio. So there are lots of examples that the challengers cited in that argument. But the court, at the end of the day, often defers to presidents on issues of immigration. And in this case, they did not get into, whether or not the Homeland Security Secretary acted appropriately. They said, she had consulted sufficiently with the State Department and that they could go ahead and end this program. And as you say, this is one of those decisions that had almost immediate consequences. The Times had a story today about Haitian healthcare workers and others who are going to face deportation and have lost their ability to work legally in the United States and may have to go back to really difficult circumstances in their home countries. And this is hundreds of thousands of people, potentially up to 1 million from many other countries.
And we've had some reporting in the Connecticut Mirror about the big impact that this is going to have specifically on the Haitian community here in Connecticut. And do you think that this is one of many cases around immigration status that we're going to see from the court? Is this part of a bigger immigration policy effort that is coming from the Trump administration that the court's going to take up? Or once again, do you see this as a kind of a narrow ruling that has to do with the temporary protected status of these particular individuals?
Yeah, that's a good question. Trump and his supporters have said this was always meant to be a temporary program. And again, there's no question that presidents of any party have the ability to end it if they follow these certain steps and look at conditions in those countries. So I wouldn't call it a narrow ruling because of the number of people that it affects so quickly. But it is pretty consistent with the way that this court has deferred to presidents on issues of immigration. And I certainly think we're going to see many more cases about immigration, just since this is such a priority for the president. We talked about the shadow docket earlier. There have been, of course, many orders from the shadow docket as well dealing with immigration policies.
And just a reminder, for those of you who are here in attendance at the Westport Library, we gave you those little cards. If you have some questions written down, in just a couple of minutes, our CT Mirror staff will be coming around collecting those, so we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. The other very consequential rulings that you talked about had to do with presidential powers, essentially to fire people within the executive branch. And these were two very interesting, very different rulings. To take us through what was so important about these particular cases and what they say about presidential powers moving forward.
Yeah, so I really struggled with how to explain just how meaningful this first case is. This is the case involving a president's ability to fire independent regulators at agencies throughout the government. You'll remember that President Trump, when he came into power, started firing thousands of federal workers, but also tried to get rid of independent regulators who had been appointed by Democratic presidents. These are at agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, in this particular case involving Rebecca Slaughter, but also at other agencies throughout the government. Congress, since the 1930s, has protected these regulators and said these commissions have to be bipartisan, there have to be staggered term limits. They've wanted the people who set regulations on business, who regulate consumer products, the environment, workplaces, they want them to be free from political pressure. And so they've said presidents have to have a pretty good reason to fire these folks before their tenures expire. And this conservative court has long embraced this unitary executive theory, which is the president is a branch onto himself of the government and needs to have full control over the executive branch. And for that reason, the court said President Trump and future presidents are free to go ahead and fire independent regulators for any reason or no reason at all, so that they can have complete control over those agencies, despite laws passed by Congress over many decades and bipartisan presidents trying to protect those folks from being fired for no reason.
And just so that I understand, but the longstanding history of this, it does come from Congress. Is it a law that the justices found unconstitutional? Was it a practice that no one had challenged before this time? What exactly was at issue?
Yeah, so President Trump was the first to say that he has this power and that the law stopping him from firing folks for no reason is unconstitutional and at odds with the separation of powers. Their point is that, again, if the president is in charge of the executive branch, all of the people in the executive branch are accountable to the president, and therefore the president should have free rein to get rid of those folks.
But then there was another case that seemingly sort of turned this on its head. So essentially the president now can fire just about anybody in the executive branch except for people in the Federal Reserve.
That's right. So the court on the very same day, in an opinion that was also written by Chief Justice John Roberts, made an exception for the powerful Federal Reserve Bank. As you'll recall, President Trump has tried to fire Lisa Cook, one of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. He was also trying to force out Jay Powell, and the court stopped short of saying that a president could do that. They didn't answer definitively, but they said that Lisa Cook, the Board of Governors member who Trump tried to fire, had not had due process and needed a chance to sort of respond to the reasoning Trump used to get rid of her, which was allegations of mortgage fraud without any sort of indictment or charge, but just allegations that he used as an excuse to get rid of her.
What on earth could possibly be so special about the Federal Reserve that could not apply to these other agency heads?
Yes, law professors have been having quite a good time with those two decisions, and it's obvious, right? This is the economy. The court heard from former heads of the Treasury Department and former chairmen of the Federal Reserve saying if you allow the president to meddle with interest rates and control the Federal Reserve, that's going to destabilize the nation's economy, and it just seems like monetary policy is more important.
It does seem that way, doesn't it? So how exactly does this change the function of government moving forward? Because in one way, Ann, one way to look at it is that it gives the president much more power in certain cases to fire people. Another way of looking at it is it gives Congress a hell of a lot less power, and it gives the court a lot more power. I'm wondering how you've been thinking about that issue, that power dynamic shift.
Yeah, I think it's another example of this court shifting power away from Congress and towards the executive, but also power for itself to say what the law is in this instance, and that these laws passed by Congress that other presidents have abided by are not valid. And so, yes, it's an expansion of presidential power. It's an expansion of the court. And if Congress were more robust, you might see legislation. And that goes back to the case we just talked about involving the temporary protected status. I mean, Congress could step in and issue new protections for Haitians and Syrians and Venezuelans if they were able to pass legislation.
So I've heard you talk about this in the past, and I think it's important to note that as we think about things in a political context, we're always thinking about what's happening right now, or what's happening in the midterm elections, or what's going to happen for the next 2 or 4 years. But these particular rulings, and all the rulings that this court has made over the course of the last couple of years that seem to expand presidential power to the benefit of Donald Trump, it also means that some of these powers are going to continue on in perpetuity to the next president, who may very well be a Democrat. How have you been looking at that? How have you and your colleagues been thinking through that particular issue? Because it's not just a today ruling, it's a ruling about executive power moving forward.
Yeah, it's particularly interesting in the case you mentioned about firing independent regulators. I have heard law professors of a more liberal persuasion saying, well, I'm not too upset or worried about this opinion because once Donald Trump is gone, if a Democrat is elected, I want that president to be able to get rid of President Trump's nominees and appointments on those same commissions. I think the broader issue is that Congress intentionally designed these agencies that oversee really important regulations that affect vast areas of our lives to be independent and to be free from political pressure. So that really changes the structure and the setup of our government as we've known it.
Yeah, it changes fundamentally what's going to happen. And if you have some of these agencies changing hands every 4 years, you don't exactly have a whole group of people who understand the issues that they're trying to regulate very well. That could be a problem for the government.
Yeah, and they're supposed to be bipartisan. They're supposed to try to reach compromise and moderation. So there could be really wild swings in policy from administration to administration.
There's a bunch more stuff to get to, and I've got a bunch of questions. The one that's right on top is great, and I'll get back to what we talked about at the top. It says very clearly, shadow docket, how to get on it, how to stop it, what's in it. Let's talk more about this idea of the shadow docket. How exactly do these things come up?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that the justices themselves are clearly struggling with. Justice Kagan and Justice Barrett were on Capitol Hill to testify about their request for more money for security for the justices. But the senators and members of the House also wanted to talk about the shadow docket and what's going on and sort of how it ruins the court's credibility when they're issuing these quick turn rulings. You heard Justice Kagan saying she thinks the court is getting better at explaining itself on the shadow docket, but there's been a lot of pushback to that as well. The justices have acknowledged that by ruling quickly on these emergency requests, they're just inviting more and more parties, not just President Trump, to file these requests. So it's sort of evolved over time. I felt like all of last summer was taken up by emergency orders. They've slowed dramatically, but as you said, we just saw a new one today, and I think ahead of the election, we'll see that as well. So yes, I think the justices are struggling with when to get involved, and then when they do get involved, how much to say. And they do seem to divide ideologically 6-3 a lot more when a case comes in quickly from the shadow docket and there's not time to have long briefing and oral argument. So I think they recognize this is not good for their reputation, and I think they're sorting it through.
Well, and I guess I'm wondering if the court, maybe specifically Chief Justice Roberts, have thought about that, the long-lasting implications of this. They're being asked more, they say yes more, and now they're getting even more. At a certain point, can Roberts himself or can the court just say, you know what, this isn't our job. We're not going to handle these things on an emergency basis because it's not good for us, it's not good for our credibility, it's not good for the country. I mean, can they just essentially shut this down, or would it take a different Chief Justice? Would it take a different court to actually stop this?
Yeah, again, it's a fierce debate among the justices. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was actually at Yale just a few months ago and gave a really lengthy, harsh critique of the shadow docket and said many of those things. She said she called the orders scratch paper musings and said they make the court seem oblivious to what's happening in the real world when they issue these orders. I didn't hear her come up with a concrete solution. I think she was sort of asking the academic community to come up with some solutions. I've heard Justice Kagan say she thinks it's a problem. They're inviting too many of these requests, but she was also a lawyer in the executive branch in the White House and sort of recognizes when a new president comes in, that president wants to be able to implement his policies and not have to wait years and years that it takes to work through the lower courts. So I think there's disagreement among the justices about how to handle it, and that's why we haven't seen some big solution.
A question that came in gets us to another one of the big cases here. It says, Trump has just relaunched sweeping tariffs against an expansive list of trade partners, recast to gain Supreme Court approval. Will the court agree? So maybe you can talk about how the court thought about tariffs from the Trump administration this particular term.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And the tariffs decision this term was actually an example of the court and the conservative majority sort of reaffirming Congress's taxing power. But as the questioner notes, that case was about a specific emergency economic law that Trump was using to put those big tariffs in place. The court said there was no mention of the word tax or tariff in that law, and therefore he could not put those tariffs in place. That was the role of Congress. But yes, Trump has now cited different statutes to put these tariffs in place, and I just have not done enough reading to know yet how the Supreme Court will respond to those tariffs. But yes, he's being very strategic. His lawyers have been planning and looking at other statutes, so they're very aware of these legal challenges and how to figure out how to do something more sustainable.
You just talked a minute ago, Ann, about how some of the justices have come out against the shadow docket. I'm wondering if you can talk about the dynamics on the court right now, possibly some things that we don't see because we don't cover the court every day like you do. What's going on behind the scenes with this particular group of justices?
Yeah, so certainly there's their writings, and you often have the three liberal justices dissenting, and Justice Jackson often writes on her own and is particularly pointed in her language. But the justices like to say that they all get along, that that's about the law, it's not personal. But we have seen, some things spill out into public view. Justice Thomas was at a judicial conference in Florida in the spring, and was sort of nostalgic about the way the relationships used to be on the court. He said it was sort of generational, that he's just not as close with his colleagues. There was an instance this term where Justice Sotomayor had to issue a rare public apology to Justice Kavanaugh in a conversation she had with some old friends who are judges publicly. She sort of implied that Justice Kavanaugh is out of touch with working class people because of an opinion he wrote about ICE stops in Los Angeles. And so again, that prompted this sort of mea culpa with Justice Sotomayor saying that she shouldn't have said that. So there were these clear sort of tensions that spilled out in different ways. I've also heard Justice Kagan talk about, does it really matter if we get along? It's more about the law and our work. We don't need to be best friends. But I would say, the old stories about Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia going to the opera together, I don't think that these justices are really hanging out together and socializing outside of the court.
Well, and I think, often I've heard those stories for years, just like everyone else. And to a certain extent, I'll just be honest, I kind of roll my eyes at that stuff because, politics is politics, and people do tend to act one way in front of the cameras and a different way behind the cameras. That all having been said, there is something different about American political life these days than there was 15, 20, 30 years ago. And I guess I'm wondering if some of the sharp critiques that are happening here actually find their way into how the court rules. Like they actually don't like each other, and that spills over into some of the rulings that we get.
I think at the end of every term, tensions are really high. Just like journalists, the justices need a deadline, and they wait till the very end of the term to issue sort of the hardest, most contentious rulings. So it's always a tense time. I do think they all recognize that they're sort of have this, they call it their common calling, and they're all in this together and dealing with really difficult issues. I think the ability to compromise has been lost more because of, as you said, maybe the confirmation process and how political that is. I think it was a real loss when Justice Breyer retired. He was somebody who kind of walked the halls and could talk to all of the justices of any stripe. And obviously Justice Kennedy was a real compromiser and a swing vote. So that's been lost. And I don't think that has to do so much with the personal relations as with just their ideology and backgrounds.
I'm shocked by the way that you would suggest that any journalist would wait until the last possible moment to file a story. I'm really quite shocked at that, Ann. What does it say right now about the moment at the court that even as they seem to be stripping away power from Congress, members of the court have gone directly to Congress to ask for more money for security. What can you tell us about this and some of the threats that have come forward to the members of the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so this was the first time since 2019 that any sitting justice had gone before Congress to answer questions about their budget request. And I think it just showed sort of how serious these security concerns are, with the justices asking for a lot more money to expand their in-house Supreme Court police force. Justice Kagan talked about how dramatically her life has changed since she first joined the court. She used to be able to go grocery shopping and drive herself around and just move a lot more freely like a regular person. And now there was the assassination attempt against Justice Kavanaugh. Justice Barrett has had lots of threats at her home in Virginia. There's been all sorts of sort of ginning up of criticism of the court that has led to a lot of this. And so the justices now have 4 to 8 agents who are assigned to them, and they have round-the-clock security at their homes. They're driven everywhere. And that's really led to the justices being a lot more isolated from the public.
We did get a question, though, here about Justices Kagan and Barrett going before Congress. This person suggesting it was quite successful, and perhaps that the justices actually appearing before Congress in this way could help to bolster public trust. Do you see that as a possibility?
I think it's good anytime the justices are out in public answering questions, giving more insight into how they operate, into how they think. I mean, they're not going to talk about their deliberations before opinions are issued, but I think the fact that they were willing to go there and answer those questions, that is good for the institution of the court. And I was just struck by how cordial and a little bit deferential the members of Congress were in their questions to the justices. They clearly see them as a co-equal branch of government, and there was just a lot of respect there, even as they were trying to ask some direct questions.
So we talked about this a little bit, and I asked you about the day that Donald Trump came to hear oral arguments, but I'm wondering if you could just take us through what a day is like when there's a big case, it's a big opinion day at the court, or they're hearing oral arguments. I mean, walk through what a day of covering this beat is like for you when it's at its most frenetic and crazy.
Yeah, so especially the end of the term, it's a lot like the end of a school year or final exam week or when you have final papers due, but with a little bit of the element of surprise and unknown because the court does not announce its opinions in advance. So we go in the final weeks, there's been a process of elimination, knowing which cases have been decided and which ones are left, but you don't know when you walk in. Most of the reporters these days, because of deadline pressures, we all gather in the press room on the bottom floor of the court building. So the courtroom is up on the first floor, and we're below in the press room. And the justices take the bench at 10 a.m., and the press officers have these big boxes that they bring into the press room, and the audio from the courtroom is piped into this room, and you hear Chief Justice Roberts say, our first opinion today is X, Y, or Z, and then the press officers open the box and hand out these opinions, and we all quickly race back to our desks and try to get out a first version of our story as quickly as we can. We do a lot of writing in advance and a lot of sort of different possible tops of our story, trying to guess what the court will do, but then the opinion itself is always something, a little bit different that we have to wrestle with quickly. And it's, a balance between wanting to be fast, but also, more importantly, to be accurate.
How long have you been covering the Supreme Court now, Ann?
It's only been maybe 3 or 4 years. I was at the Washington Post for 20 years, and I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, the work at the Supreme Court became more than one person could handle. So I became a partner to my mentor, Bob Barnes, who was at the Post for many years, and helped him cover the Supreme Court. And then when Adam Liptak stepped back from day-to-day coverage about a year ago, I joined the Times to cover the court full-time.
So, because our audience is always just a bunch of journalism nerds and wants to know how people do this particular work, like, how did you learn how to take those rulings that were, unboxed by John Roberts and given to you, and here's a many page dissent that comes from one justice that goes against the ruling itself? How did you learn how to read through these for the pertinent facts, the things that matter most to the people who are reading your stories?
Yeah, so I had a lot of practice covering the lower courts for more than 12 years at the Post. So I was at the district court in Washington day in and day out, covering some big public corruption cases involving city council members and our mayor. And then I started covering the courts of appeals at the DC Circuit and the Fourth Circuit. So I had a lot of practice reading court filings and reading court opinions on deadline and trying to quickly distill what was most important. Some of my favorite opinions are the ones that start with like a really punchy, plain language description of what the court is doing, but that doesn't always happen. I find the dissents really helpful. They sort of explain what they think their colleagues are doing. So that was really good practice to prepare me for covering the Supreme Court. And then, as I said, I worked very closely with Bob Barnes at the Post and learned just a ton from him. And now I'm lucky that Adam Liptak still sits across from me, and my colleague Abby Van Sickle. So it's a real team effort.
How much law do you have to know? I mean, you're not a lawyer, but you've had to study quite a bit of law to actually parse through the ways in which justice is right, to listen for the things that people are saying during oral arguments. I mean, how much legal knowledge do you have to bring to the job, Ann?
Yeah, I think the more reading that you can do about any case ahead of time, reading the briefs is critical, reading the appeals court decisions is critical, talking to academics when there are things that I don't understand. I think it's been helpful for me not to write in legalese. I'm trying to explain it in plain language, but also language that's sophisticated enough for lawyers who know a lot more than I do to understand what's happening. So there are lots of people I can draw on when there are concepts that I'm not familiar with, and I'm learning constantly, and it's just a great challenge and an opportunity every case that comes along.
One of my favorite things about your biography is that during your Nieman Fellowship, you studied law and poetry. How does being a poet or studying poetry help you in your work?
Yeah, so I'm not a poet, but during my Nieman Fellowship at Harvard in 2015, we really had free range to study whatever interested us and whatever we thought would make our work deeper and more meaningful. So I did take law school classes. I took a great First Amendment class, constitutional law class that was directly relevant to my work, but I was also very interested in the poetry of Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet. And that was just something that I had never done as an undergraduate. And I was just struck by sort of the power in small words. We got to go look at his archives and sort of see his manuscripts for different poems and how he tried out different words that had different impact and different sounds. So I think it just taught me sort of how small words can have a big impact.
I would spend an entire hour talking with you about Seamus Heaney, but I'm not going to do that for this particular group. You also come from a newspaper family. Your father is a renowned, award-winning investigative journalist and editor. Talk to me about what it was like to grow up in a newspaper family and how that prepared you to do this high-level work covering the court.
Yeah, thanks for asking about my dad, who's a proud 1969 graduate of Trinity College in Hartford, where he studied a lot of Shakespeare. So when I was a kid growing up, he was at the Philadelphia Inquirer and an investigative reporter. And in those days, there were no cell phones. So his sources would call our house, and I would answer the phone in our kitchen, and they would leave messages for my dad using code names. And it all just seemed like very mysterious and important. And then the next day, the Inquirer would be delivered to our doorstep, and I would see stories that he wrote about corrupt mayors, about corrupt police officers, and just the impact that those stories had. So I tried to follow my own path, and I was a government major at Cornell and thought I might go to law school. But my first job out of college was at Congressional Quarterly, and I was just quickly attracted to the work that all the reporters were doing running up to Capitol Hill. And my dad is somebody I can call anytime I'm struggling with a story, and he has lots of lessons that I keep with me doing the work that I do every day.
I'll just say parenthetically, and Ann and I don't know each other before this. Bill Marimow was the head of NPR News for some time during his career, and he was a great mentor to me. He actually hired me for an editing job in Washington, D.C., and spent some high-quality time sitting down with me and talking to me about how to do this work. So say hi to your dad for me.
Thanks, John.
I'll also just ask quickly, did you ever have a moment where you're a kid and somebody calls and you literally have to go like, Dad, there's a guy named Deep Throat calling? Like, was it that level of like secrecy or what?
So some of his sources were named for the places that they would meet. So one source he would meet at what was called Girard Bank in Philadelphia back in the day. And so he was Mr. Girard. And yeah, so I would take messages and I didn't know what it was about. But then, like I said, I would see the stories the next day or a few days later and kind of connect the dots about what was happening.
That's fantastic. We have some more questions I want to get to. Somebody's asking for a bit of historical perspective. Other than FDR's attempt to pack the court, was there any other parallel to pushing the boundaries of executive power in the court in U.S. history that you've seen, Ann?
Not that I'm aware of, but that's something that I should look into in more depth. The FDR example is the one that comes up repeatedly. And I thought it was interesting that when President Biden looked at reforming the court, that there was a lot of pushback to the idea that we should change the court just because we don't like the decisions that it's issuing right now. But I think anytime there is a controversial decision, we see this renewed push on the Hill. I think term limits are actually quite popular on a bipartisan basis. So I think that's something to watch for.
They're very popular on a bipartisan basis. Do you see any basis in reality for that? That's something that people have been asking for quite some time, because now within the last couple of years, last couple terms, you've had these instances in which if someone decides to retire or, God forbid, passes away at an inopportune time, it changes the structure of the court for years and years to come.
Yeah, I don't see any movement in this Congress. It's similar to redistricting. I mean, I think the public feels really strongly that should not be partisan. So I think these are really tough issues that the current makeup of Congress is not going to tackle.
Can we look ahead before we run out of time at some of the biggest cases that we're going to be watching for next? What is going to be, aside from all this stuff that's going to come down on a nearly daily basis to the shadow docket of the Supreme Court, what big cases is the court going to be looking at during its next term?
Yeah, it's still pretty early. The court has only accepted about maybe even less than half of the total cases that it will hear next term. But one that you all may be interested in is a Second Amendment challenge to state laws that ban or restrict high-powered rifles like AR-15s, and specifically there's a challenge to Connecticut's law. So that's going to be a huge Second Amendment case. As I'm sure you're aware, the court has been expanding gun rights, and lower courts have been really struggling to figure out how to implement the court's decisions on this front. So that's a big one to watch. I think you'll see the court continue to get involved in sort of culture war issues. They've been rolling back transgender rights, for instance, after expanding trans rights in the workplace, for instance. So there's a case coming up having to do with a Catholic school in Colorado that's challenging the state's refusal to give state funding to preschools that don't accept gay parents or the children of gay parents.
Can you explain to the people who are largely listening here in Connecticut why it seems like almost every single one of these cases that has to do with certain culture war issues comes from Colorado?
That's a real question I have too. Yeah, I may do a story about that, so stay tuned.
I mean, on the larger front, you bring up a few of these issues, whether it has to do with gun rights, whether it has to do with LGBTQ issues. Do you see these as the things that the court is going to be grappling with over the course of the next several terms more than anything else? I mean, are these culture war issues kind of here to stay with this court?
That's a great question. I think that the court, with its decision overturning Roe v. Wade, I think was hoping to get out of the business of deciding abortion issues, but they quickly realized that that's not the case. I think we could see a case having to do with access to mifepristone, one of the abortion medications. I think, again, with voting rights, the case this term was really significant. And I think we're going to see a lot of cases that are fallout from that ruling as well.
We got a couple of questions from people about this basic idea about what can and will be done to rein in the court. The idea that the court, in many people's minds, many Americans' minds, has broken with some of the norms of the Supreme Court of the past, that they're doing things in a very, very different way. Is that something that either you hear an awful lot about amongst the people that you're talking to on a daily basis, people who are in the academic environment? Is there some sense that this court is acting so far outside the norms of the way the court has acted in the past that it needs to be, quote unquote, reined in?
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw that most prominently, again, after the decision in Dobbs to overturn Roe v. Wade, and the idea that the court would roll back this constitutional right that had been in effect for 50 years. And then again, in the court's decision granting President Trump and other presidents immunity from prosecution, so that was just seen as a huge expansion of power and so favorable to President Trump. And sort of the ramifications still to be seen. So yes, I think anytime there's one of these boundary-pushing decisions, we're seeing calls for reform. I think it's mostly in the political arena. I think we see more proposals pop up before an election. But again, I mean, I think it would take some sort of ballot initiative or constitutional amendment. I don't see it coming from Congress, or not, at least not with this Congress.
You wrote during the course of this term about Justice Alito and the, I suppose, outside influence he has on some of the issues that we talked about today. Can you just talk a little bit more for us about Sam Alito right now, his place in the court, and also the fact that some people reported erroneously that he was going to retire. Maybe you could talk for a moment about Sam Alito and what you're looking for from him moving forward.
Yeah, that was another big question going into the term. Would Justice Alito retire and give President Trump an opening to name a fourth justice? But Justice Alito seems to be sort of enjoying being in the majority. The court has become more and more conservative. Chief Justice Roberts, who joined the court right around the same time as Justice Alito, has really entrusted him with a lot of these big decisions. So not only did he write the Dobbs decision, but also the voting rights case this term. And when Chief Justice Roberts is in the majority, he gets to assign that opinion. So that's, again, a real show of trust in Justice Alito. So people close to the justice say, why would he leave when he's sort of at the height of his influence and really winning? On the flip side, I think Justice Alito would want to be replaced by someone who shares his ideology. So there's the risk that he does not retire in time for that to happen. And as you mentioned, that was unfortunate on the last day of the term and really added to a lot of stress when that was reported erroneously that he was retiring. And we were all scrambling to read the birthright citizenship opinion at the same time trying to bat down the inaccurate reports.
Yeah, so that probably caused an unnecessarily stressful day for you and your colleagues.
It was incredibly stressful. It was a very rare moment where the press officer came out into the press room and, very loudly said, "This reporting is inaccurate. Do not report this." But we still had to track it down on our own. At the same time, we were trying to make sense of the birthright citizenship decision.
Well, I appreciate, Ann, very much the fact that there is news breaking on your beat tonight and that your colleague Abby stepped in and said, I'll cover this so that Ann can talk to the good people of Connecticut. Ann, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your great coverage throughout the course of this past year and all the time. Thank you.
Thanks for your interest. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our partners at the beautiful Westport Library, and of course our audience here and our audience watching at home. Special thanks to Celia Klotzer, who produces our live events for the Mirror, and to everyone from the Connecticut Mirror who came out to help with tonight's event, including our publisher Bruce Potterman and all the members of our board. Next up for our live events series on Wednesday, August 26th, I'm going to be sitting down with Senator Chris Murphy. It's part of the Mirror's In the Room series. We will be in the room in a studio at our offices up in Hartford. You can visit ctmirror.org/events for more information. While you're there and you knew that I'd make a pitch, make sure to press that donate button in the upper right-hand corner. The reason why is because organizations like the Mirror that win a Pulitzer Prize do so because of listener support, viewer support, reader support, because people who actually care about the news being even-handed, being fair, being on the ground with people in Hartford and in Washington, telling you what's happening, that comes directly from people who support it. So I can't thank you enough for supporting the Mirror if you have, and I implore you to support it in the future so that it can continue to grow and thrive. Please drive home safe from here in Westport. Please enjoy at home, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.